Okay, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and this is entry 17 in the 2017 RPG a Day exercise. If this is your first time seeing one of these videos, this exercise is asking us to answer 31 questions in the month of August 2017 that do with role-playing games. Today's question is, which RPG have you owned the longest but not played? So this one I've actually been, of the questions for the month, when I started looking through the questions to start with and thinking about what possible responses might be, this is actually one of the ones that I was the most interested in answering. Because this is sort of, it asks you to think about one of your gaming white whales, one of the games that just is you've never been able to actually get to. And for me, it's actually, I think maybe it is the oldest game that has remained a white whale, in the sense that I've owned this for quite a long time and I still have yet to actually run it. I've prepped it a couple of times and come close to running it, but never actually pulled the trigger on it. And that game is Ars Magica. Now this is the third edition of Ars Magica, and I also own a bunch of stuff for the 5th edition. I dived back into the 5th edition recently because I had heard really great things about it. But third is the one that really sort of captured my imagination. This game was, actually, I don't know what the first two companies were that published it. What the game is, I guess, just as a background, is it's set in a mythic version of Europe of the either late 12th or early 13th century. The characters you play, here's a quick map of the setting to give you a sense of the feel. So it's mythic Europe is a place where it's like historical Europe, but where fairies and magic and divine power and demonic threats are all very real presences in the world. And that has, the way that they've interpreted that has changed over the editions. I can only speak for the 3rd and the 5th, but there's significant differences in the way that they emphasize those different realms of power in the different games. But what has remained the same throughout the editions is that in the game, you'll have a number of players. The default assumption is using what's called the Covenant approach. And what you do is every person playing in the game, or every person who's involved in the game, including the default dungeon master, I guess, everyone will be creating two characters, which are a mage or a magus and a companion. The magus is, in this game, magic is very, very powerful. It's can be quite easily improvised to a degree. I mean, like, you're limited by your specific capabilities in the different areas of magic. But for the default magic system, the Hermetic magic, it divides basically into, it's called techniques and forms. And I'm trying to remember which one's which. I think the techniques are the ones that are, it's like verb and noun is kind of the way it works. So your forms are your nouns. So it's like animal, or uses a lot of Latin in it. So it's terram, ignem. Terram is earth magics. Ignem is fire magics. Aquam is water magics, and so forth. So they've got a bunch of different of those, and then you use your techniques to combine them with them. So your techniques would be things like creo or creo, which is creation. Perdo, which is to destroy, rego, which is to transform, and so forth. So you combine those two things. Creo, ignem means you're creating fire, and that's just spread across the different techniques and forms. Your degrees of capability and your techniques and forms kind of makes what sort of magus you are, what kind of magician you are. And then there's a background system, so you can really make some very unique characters for it. The companions are kind of like, hero level. They're not quite as capable or as diverse as what the mages are, or magi, I guess, are, but they're still quite capable. There are things like, you could be a traveling troubadour or a knight or a noble or a I don't know, like whatever sort of neat idea, someone who's not a magus, but who happens to be involved with this covenant. And then there are sort of tertiary characters who are NPCs, or rather, I'm sorry, they're PCs, but they're not controlled by any one player. They're sort of members of the like named characters, or named characters, I should say, of the covenant, but they're not sufficiently important to justify, being in all the scenes. So it'll be things like, the guard who travels and protects the one of the maguses, or like a baker, or a archer, like a footman or footman archer kind of thing. And then what happens is each session, someone takes the role of the storyteller, which I think is called storyteller in this, which is your DM. So someone becomes the DM, and they will tell the story, and then one person will play their magus, and then everyone else will play their companions, and then they pick which other tertiary characters they bring along with them. They're called grogs in this. And then that's how each adventure sort of functions. The game is, I think there's one adventure per season in it, because the game embraces the idea of there being the seasons sort of changing, and that being a way of dictating the flow of time over the course of a chronicle, which is what they call a campaign. And then everyone else's magus, like the DM's magus, the other players who are not playing their magus, all of those have time to do research and so forth. And those are ways to advance their characters. And there's a lot of things you can only do in downtime, or effectively what like other games deal as downtime. So your characters that don't happen to be involved in the adventure still get some kind of benefit. Now I understand that there's some issues with characters who are doing adventures getting significantly more XP, but to be honest, that's what I've read about the game. I haven't run it, so I don't know whether that actually, that plays out that way as well. But the neat thing is that the one of the ideas behind the game is that it's a shared world. So you can pass the DM reins to someone else, and someone else can say, like, listen, in where, like if your covenant is set in sort of like, northern England, and you've got a bunch of things around where your covenant is. There is a town nearby. There is a fairy glade, which is supposed to be, involved with them. And there's a series of barrows which date back to sort of the age of Viking invasions. Those may be some places there, and then the main DM may be dealing with the town, and then one of the other players can say, okay, I'm going to claim dibs on the barrows because I like that what's there, and I got an idea of what a story will be there. So it's cool in that sense. I love the idea that it's a collaborative world, even more so than just having the different players and whatever. With the players interacting with the world and then changing it that way. There's actually a different authors kind of for the world who are able to stamp their own feel on it, and to give it a really, really shared experience. So that's a really, really cool concept. That's the game, or the game in a nutshell, and that's what's remained consistent throughout the editions. And that I found really, really intriguing. I run far more than I ever play. I enjoy playing, but I don't get the opportunity to do it as much as I would like. So it's interesting setting up a campaigns to allow for people to allow for me to play, and also to encourage other players to get a chance to try DMing too. In our gaming group, we've got a couple other folks who sometimes run things, but then we've also got one person who is interested, who has expressed so far the interest in running something, but just has not had a chance yet. So that's interesting to me. I mean, that's something I think is very, very cool about the system. Now, sort of why I haven't run it yet. The primary reason is, well, for one, I owned it for a very, very long time, and then I sold my copy, and then I got the same book, not the identical same book, but the same edition back when I had when I first had the opportunity. And I think that there's a couple barriers that I found to ever running it. One of them was that I didn't feel that I understood the medieval world well enough. And to be honest, like it was the same problem I had when I had Mage: The Sorcerer's Crusade. Which is another game published by White Wolf. I absolutely love that game, and it set my mind reeling. And to be honest, it really when I went to university and I started taking history courses, it's why I skewed towards Renaissance and Reformation history largely, is because I love that setting. But the thing is I didn't feel that I could do the game the proper justification without actually having a better understanding of the medieval world, the medieval mindset, and things like that. So that's one major way. And the other thing is there's a lot to get through in the game. Like I mentioned what the magic system is. So that's a little. It's fairly involved, and it's more than I think that a casual player could wrap their head around. Maybe I'm wrong about that, actually. I might be wrong. Maybe that's not the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem is the downtime rules. Those can get quite complicated as well, which I'm trying to find where the section is on laboratories. So those take up about this much space here. This is all laboratory rules, which maybe doesn't seem like a lot, but these are it's very, very dense text in here. There's very few illustrations, so there's a lot of material to get through, and I've always felt that it may have been a little too esoteric for some of the folks who I normally play with. There are some folks who are really into in-depth immersive stuff, but more people than not would just be as happy to play, something that is quite blatantly ahistorical and really not give a shit about whether it's historically accurate or whatever. And they wouldn't really want to get too involved in that the math components or the sub game that's involved in the laboratory rules. So and it's not to say that I haven't tried. There's plenty of other games that have been fairly complex that I've kind of forced on my players as hey, we're playing this tonight. So I'm not sure why this hasn't. Well, actually, that's not true. I think I do have an idea. So the task resolution in this is a D10, and there's two kind. You just roll D10 and you add your stat and you add your skill, or you add your if you're spell casting, you add your technique and you add your form. One of the things is if it's a stress roll, then dice explode on that, and I believe that they continue to explode. That's the way it is in the 3rd edition. I don't honestly can't remember if that's the way it is in the 5th edition. Yeah, it's I guess that's the other thing, is that making characters in this is a very, very, in the 3rd edition, is a very complex system. Like, you got to track the certain amounts of experience points you have, and different levels of skills cost different points. So it's not a kind of thing where you can just sit down, slap some numbers together and be done with it. There is some forethought, and that hasn't gotten simpler in the 5th edition. 5th edition still does the same kind of XP budget thing. With mages, you also have to determine how you're spending your points, and like, if you fully understand what those points are being spent towards, then that's that's fine. But what I think it means for a casual player is that there's a lot higher buy-in for just casually for jumping into this game. You need to know a lot about the magic in order to make your magic character. Now, you could easily just say, all right, well, the player who gives a shit the most about magic, we're going to start with him as a magus, and we'll create your other magi afterwards. But that's not the way the game is assumed to be played. And if you're doing that, then you're losing out, I think, on some of the experience of the game, or I think you would. So maybe that's just an excuse as to why I haven't just pulled the trigger on it. But getting back to the dice mechanic, I'm not sure if that dice mechanic is going to be sufficient. I feel like it's just rolling one dice, in particular if it's exploding, is going to feel really swingy. It's going to feel really unpredictable to figure out conceptually figure out what your character is capable of, and predict the results quite easily. There are I can't remember what they're called, fate points or something like that, feat points in this as well. which confidence points, which can mitigate that in the same way that like action points or hero points or whatever in other games can mitigate things. So maybe that's just a shitty excuse as well too. But at the end of the day, the closest I came to actually running this was recently for my annual once a year gaming. I get together with friends in my hometown, and I run something that I don't normally run. This year I ended up running Conan, and we had a really great time with that. I really enjoyed that game. But before that, I had almost fully together an idea for a Ars Magica game, but the reason I abandoned it was because there was far more to that one session. I couldn't have got it done in the 11 hours or whatever we played. It would have required much, much longer, and I didn't think that my players would buy into the idea of this being an ongoing campaign. I floated this as an idea to my players multiple times. I've never had anyone bite. The closest I've had anyone bite to running a game like this is we got very close to running a Dark Ages vampire game, and that shares a lot of the similar kind of aspects of this. And I think that might be an easier sell, just because there's less to understand. Vampire Dark Ages is a medieval version of the Vampire the Masquerade game that was published by White Wolf and now co-published, I guess, by Onyx Path Publishing. But that game has there is complex sort of vampire politics to know, but the system, the mechanics and stuff isn't quite as daunting as the Ars Magica ones are. And I should add as well, there's also a political component to the game as well. There are different houses of mages, of magi in it, and they are involved in this specific political structure called tribunals for different regions. So you actually have a fairly big political component to it as well. So like the game itself is, I mean, there's tons of great story and role-playing opportunities in it. I think that I enjoy reading the game an awful lot. I don't really enjoy making characters for it because it is really a math intensive, tracking how much points you're spending in different things. Like it is not something intuitive that you can do. You have to sit and flip through the rule book. So it does sort of have an old school feel to that. One thing they dropped in the 5th edition that I don't like actually is that the 3rd edition used to have two very sort of parallel sets of combat rules. One was for kind of quick and dirty combat where there was a lot of like averages that were used to speed things up. And then there was a cinematic combat system. And that to me was really cool. I haven't seen it in play, so I don't know how the two of them played out. Surely the fact that it was dumped for, I think, the 4th and then it wasn't brought back in the 5th, maybe they felt that it wasn't, the level of complexity wasn't worth it. But it's a shame they did drop that. I found it very, very, very cool. And actually, I should mention as well too, one of the artists who does the interior art in the 3rd edition is an artist who's become much more widely known since William O'Connor. And William O'Connor has done tons of art for Wizards of the Coast through Magic Cards and through the various editions of Dungeons and Dragons. In particular, 4th edition, he does a lot of the art in the core books for them. But this is one of his earlier works, and there's a couple pieces in here that are just line works of his that I think are just super, super cool. Like that is super evocative. The big demon, kind of warrior demon haunting or lurking on top of the mine here like that, waiting to get to the hooded figure beneath. And then these guys, and you can see there's knights that are fighting on horseback in the ruins of a fallen colossus. And I'll only show you one more here. This is pretty cool too. We got a knight charging down on a footman. So I mean, that's one of the reasons why the game really has stuck with me. It's been a game that sort of lurked in the back of my mind. So if you can tell, I mean, I'm sort of ambiguous about the game. There's a lot of it, that aspects of it that I really, really love, but there's also a lot of reservations I have about running it, which have led me to, for this to continue to be a white whale for me. And I guess it's not a question that's being asked by today's question, but it's just, I think it's a natural flow of, well, why wouldn't I run this? Like, why would I not put this in my slate of games and just pull the trigger and run something? And I think that the problem I have is I still don't know. I couldn't run it the way that it's designed. I think as a Covenant type game, I just don't think that the folks I game with are really it's gonna click with them the way that some of the other games that we've run, like for instance, Star Wars Fantasy Flight is I think hands down my gaming group's favorite game. I think it's an awesome game as well too. I really love. I think of all the Star Wars editions, it's my favorite. It runs very, very easy to run, very easy to prep and whatnot. I'm just presently dealing with a little burnout from the game because we've been running it for quite a few years. I shouldn't say a few years. It's been about almost 2 years, but so this is, like I said, I don't think it'll speak to the group all that much. So what I could do is at best run like a one shot with it, and in that case, what do I think would be the way to run a one shot with this that would highlight the things that are cool about this game that distinguish it from other games. And the things that distinguish it from other games, I think, are like the Covenant system and the shared, like the rotating storyteller system. The magic system is pretty cool as well too, but there's I don't think that's the only feature of the game. So, and I guess maybe that's one final thing I'll say too is as I have learned more about the medieval world and got a better sense of how to depict that. And in defense of the game, they have published for many of the editions great supplements for helping storytellers get through that. Like for instance, the Medieval Handbook, which is a guide sort of to what life is like. Now, this one I had difficulty getting through because it's presented as kind of like a faux travel log. And this may make me a bad gamer, but like I fucking hate game fiction. I can't stand the interstitial, little mini stories that lead into chapters in role playing games. Like I never read them. The only ones I've ever read is a handful of ones from BattleTech Products, but that's because I love that setting. But anyway, so the Medieval Handbook does help with that. I have slogged my way through some of that, but I didn't really like it all that much. But I did learn some stuff, so I guess that's the sign. They also give you, there's Mythic Europe, which is a great source book for basically what's going on in the different countries, or I guess countries, they're not nations yet, in Europe, and what sort of how the different domains, the divine, the demonic or infernal, the fairy, the magical, how those sort of interact. In this edition, they also introduced an idea for the domain of reason, which was rejected or dumped in 5th edition. That's because White Wolf also published the Mage the Ascension game, and that tied in with that idea of that reason could tie in with the Technoman. Well, and if you want to see about Mage, I encourage you to take a look at, I think it's my first video in this series. I talk at length at that. That'll set out what Mage is, but just one of the ways that the different editions change was that. But anyway, resources. There's also Wizard's Grimoire, which gives you a ton of new sample spells and a couple new sample archetypes to inspire you for how to build your own characters. There's tons of source books for the different tribunals too. So if you want Rome and Iberia and Mistridge is sort of the default one. There's also Adventures, Deadly Legacy, and source books for the different powers. This one happens to be about the divine powers. And very similar source books are for the other editions as well too. I won't necessarily, well, I got them here, I guess, anyway. So there's tons of resources for the newer editions as well too, which are very much the same. There are tribunal books, power books. I play books that focus on certain themes, like the City and Guild. There's one for nobility. Hedge Magic, if you want to play a character who's different from the traditional, what do you call it, hermetic mages. And then there are supplement books like Covenants, where it gives you extra rules for different sub-aspects of the game. Overall, like the 5th edition is great, as well as, you know, it's a really, really great line. There's some really cool stuff in here. I really like the books. They're a lot of fun to read. And they give you some good ideas, practical ideas of how to incorporate this stuff into play. One thing I really, and I don't mind that, I don't know, I don't like this, but one of the things that I really dislike about the 5th edition, and maybe it's true of the 3rd edition as well too, but the 3rd edition was published in the 90s, so it has the excuse of why it routinely refers to other splat books and stuff. This edition, 5th edition, the core book is fine. The core book gives you a bunch of, enough to get a campaign going. But as soon as you start diving into any of these source books, they routinely reference, you know, 4 to 5 other source books in the course of the thing, and give you nothing to fill the gaps if you don't own those source books. And it's a pretty expansive line, which is great. I mean, it was well supported, but it's a really fucking irritating aspect of the play. And part of me says, all right, well, you could just ignore it, and you can just, you know, come up with your own rules for stuff, I guess. Or they're, you know, they're assuming that you're going to be buying everything for it because you're, you know, if you're an Ars Magica fan, they've got a huge line for it. But it really just strikes me as a cash grab, and that it's a way of organizing source books that strikes me as a very dated way. Like that's what drove most companies' game lines in the 90s, and that was a really irritating fucking thing to do. So so I don't like that aspect of 5th edition. My collection ended up getting like, this is actually part of a, you know, just part of it. There's more downstairs, but so I don't mind, because I'm a kind of a hoarder. I don't mind picking up things, but if you're deciding, you know, to give this kind of game a try, I would suggest maybe taking a look at the 3rd edition. It's cheaper. You can get it for, if not in print, you can get it online for quite cheap. And I think that, yeah, I don't know. There's certainly more than enough material there to ever, you know, to ever run the game. But this is drifting much more into a review than into just talking about the game I haven't run. So I don't know. So that's my game for game I've owned the longest and haven't run. I don't know why I haven't. I should just pull the trigger on it, but I think, as you can see, I'm having a hard time struggling with what I would do in a one shot to really showcase the world. And at best, what I've come up with in the past is I'm showcasing the medieval world. And that's where I guess maybe another problem I've had, and this is just a subjective thing, is that I have a hard time grasping what that world looks like. How far do I drift into fantasy before, you know, I'm getting away from this kind of medieval world? And that's a stupid way of a stupid reason for holding back from playing, because obviously, like, a game is whatever you want to make it. If I want to, one of the things they talk about in the 3rd edition is how one of the earliest editions of the game was set in a world that was a medieval world, but it was in North America, and it assumed that the Romans had conquered North America. So they weren't beholden to any kind of actual history. They were able to just set up the countryside the way they want, and they played that way. That's great. And I mean, like, I've known about that you can just make it whatever you want. But for whatever reason, I've just I haven't got past the problem of wanting to know, you know, enough about the medieval world to be able to make a convincing portrayal of it, make the players play, feel like they're playing in a medieval world rather than just a fantasy, you know, a fantasy version of that, but also incorporate the magical stuff. So, and I guess that's also something that could just be resolved with a set of brainstorming, you know, or a session to just sit down and brainstorm out some ideas for what I see the world looking like. But I haven't done it yet, and I've owned this game for, you know, at least 20 years now. So anyway, that is my very, very long and sort of meandering answer to that question. Tomorrow, the question is, which RPG have you played the most in your life? That should be a fairly quick one. I'm not going to bring visual aids because many of my visual aids are packed because I'm moving at the end of the month. So if you have any questions or comments, regarding my answer, or if you have any suggestions on how best to approach Ars Magica, I'd love to hear them. In particular, anyone who has actual play experience with it too, with players who are less invested in the medieval world than what maybe the DM or some of the players are. I'd really appreciate those thoughts, because it's, as you can tell, it's a game I would love to give a go to, because there's a lot of things about it that are really cool that I think would make for really, really fun play. I just have those stumbling blocks with it. So anyway, thanks for listening and watching, I suppose. If you have, again, any questions or comments, leave them below. I will see you folks again tomorrow. Talk about the game I've played the most. Thanks.